Hi, Hugo.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
Good, good, thank you. And you?
I'm pretty good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Hugo Mercier. You are a cognitive scientist. For a while, you were here in the States at the University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
Now you are in France, which I take it is your country of origin.
yeah.
And where are you exactly in France?
So my lab is based in Lyon. It's the second largest city, kind of south of Paris, and it's called the Institut des Sciences Cognitives, the Cognitive Science Institute, which is a nice lab because it does, kind of, as the name suggests, bundle together people across the cognitive sciences, so kind of linguists and philosophers and psychologists and neuroscientists. So it's a nice place to work at.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I'm really looking forward to our conversation because you are closely associated with something called the argumentative theory of reasoning. And we're living in a time when there's a lot of arguing going on. It's less clear how effective the reasoning is. There seem to be a lot of cases where people are arguing but failing to reason together toward a commonly acceptable solution. In fact, on the radio this morning here on NPR, I heard they're doing a series called "The Divided States of America." So I thought, somebody with a theory called the argumentative theory of reasoning, which I guess was originally attributed to Dan Sperber, your colleague, an anthropologist, but then you have become a collaborator of his, and you two wrote kind of the big paper on this called "Why Do Humans Reason?" Arguments for an Argumentative Theory in Behavioral and Brain Sciences a few years ago, which got a whole lot of attention and a lot of press coverage and so on. And it has become kind of, I think, the document to refer to in talking about this. I do think that your ideas shed a lot of light on like why maybe sometimes we fail to reason effectively, and also why sometimes we do reason effectively in other contexts. Before we get started talking about it, do you want to tell me if you share this perception, speaking from France, that we are in a time of polarization and fragmentation in some kind of broad sense? It certainly seems to be the case here in the States.
Yeah, I mean that would be a question more for a political scientist or a sociologist maybe, but my reading of the data in the US is that indeed there has been a lot of polarization. It has been most clearly the case in Congress. So there's a lot of good data about how politicians vote what when, and it's clear that the two camps are increasingly separate. Like no Republican is going to vote for something from the other camp, and vice versa. Um, it has also been the case in the public to a lesser extent, but there has been some polarization. I don't know if there is similar data in other countries.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible. I think it's often easy enough to forget how vitriolic things were in the past as well, and to have this kind of idea of a kind of golden age of conversation and all that. And it's on the whole, I think it's largely misguided. But yeah, in the case of the US, that does seem to be data suggesting that there is increasing polarization
Okay.
among the public, and that might be one of the reasons why politics aren't going as well as arguably they could be going.
Okay. So your theory grows out of evolutionary psychology. It's a theory about what reasoning faculties were designed for by natural selection. And let me introduce it, if you'll let me indulge in a little bit of self promotion.
Hmm.
In 1994, when evolutionary psychology was just taking shape, I wrote this book, The Moral Animal. Um, and when I first heard about your theory, I was reminded of a little part of it. There's a paragraph in it I want to read, and I want to see how much of your theory it captures and how much it doesn't capture.
Hmm.
This was when the field was kind of just taking shape, and here's what I wrote. The proposition here is that the human brain is, in large part, a machine for winning arguments, a machine for convincing others that its owner is in the right, and thus a machine for convincing its owner of the same thing. The brain is like a good lawyer. Given any set of interests to defend, it sets about convincing the world of their moral and logical worth, regardless of whether they in fact have any of either. Like a lawyer, the human brain wants victory, not truth, and like a lawyer, it is sometimes more admirable for skill than for virtue. Now, when I first read in the New York Times an account of your theory as laid out in this paper I referred to, at first I thought, well, that sounds just like what I said. I mean, you know how that works. Like whenever you hear an idea that sounds anything like one of your ideas, you say, wait a second, I said that first. And in fact, that is relevant to what you're talking about, right? Like one of the biases is to think we deserve more credit than we actually deserve, and to think that other people deserve less credit than they. I mean, I don't think you get into that a lot in this paper, but it's kind of a documented thing, and it's not irrelevant. But what I want to ask is, I mean, then as I looked at your paper, I thought, well, actually, I mean, there are some differences here between this and what I said. One is that, of course, this is, whereas mine was kind of an empirically formed hypothesis, maybe you're now trying to work this out into a full-fledged theory, which is a different enterprise, and you say it makes certain predictions, let's test them, and so on. But also, tell me if I'm wrong here, I think your view is maybe a little rosier or less relentlessly cynical than the view that embodied in that paragraph of mine. Is that right?
Yeah, that's completely right. The main difference, I think, is that for us, we not only stress how people produce arguments, and there we would agree with you that it's mostly to convince others, but the fact that we also have to evaluate other people's arguments, and that when we do this, then the goal is to try to make sure that the arguments are right, not only so that we can discard bad arguments, but also so that we can recognize good ones and then change our minds. And if there wasn't this balance, then there would be no point producing arguments, because, I mean, if it was widely known that the arguments are purely kind of self-centered and that you don't care at all about them being, actually good arguments, no one would pay any attention to them, and then it would become useless producing them. And basically, the framework we set ourselves in is that of the evolution of communication. And so we know that for communication to be stable in a species, it has to be beneficial both for those who send and for those who receive. And it's the same is true for argumentation. Argumentation, so by definition, is a part of communication. And so it has to be beneficial both for those who communicate arguments and for those who receive them.
Well, yeah. Well, here's the way I see it, which is kind of the same way, although maybe a little less rosy. So for communication to evolve in the first place, there has to be a commonality of interest between sender and recipient, right? For communication to exist there has to be a non-zero-sum relationship initially between the two, because in a purely zero-sum relationship, when there's no commonality of interest, there's no incentive to honestly communicate about anything. There's no incentive to believe anything the other person says. So, and of course, evolution features commonalities of interest. For one thing, there are close kin, who share genes, and so it's like you want to communicate a certain amount of honest stuff to your offspring, to your siblings, on Darwinian grounds alone. So there's that. Now, that has to be the case for communication to come into existence. On the other hand, once communication exists, there is it makes sense to exploit it to selfish ends, right? Like if I have a difference of interest with you, like there's some resource we both want, and we both want to argue that we deserve it. I say I deserve it, you say it makes sense that the brain would evolve mechanisms for something other than what you might call purely honest communication, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. So that's actually one of the reasons why we think argumentation evolves. So for us, and more precisely, the rationale that we put forward for the evolution of argumentation is that there is this issue of trust that you are describing in communication, because even though there has to be some kind of commonality of interest, the interests never really completely overlap, and so the senders always have some kind of incentive to manipulate, kind of deceive receivers, and so. And so you have to have mechanisms to make sure that on the whole the senders are mostly honest, or most of the messages are beneficial to the receivers. And so one of the ways humans do this is that they calibrate their trust, so we can try to gauge who is competent, who is incompetent, who is kind of nice towards you, and who isn't nice. But the problem with trust is that it's often kind of long to build, and it can be kind of easily destroyed. And we think that, and it's kind of sort of relatively imprecise. So I can sort of trust someone, but there are kind of sometimes you want a more fine-grained mechanism to tell whether that specific message should be believed or not. Mm-hmm. And we think that this is what argumentation does. So in many cases you don't trust people enough to just take their word for something. But then if they give you strong enough arguments, you might change your mind. So in a way, argumentation would be a way of overcoming this vigilance that we have towards senders, so that we can better discriminate when we should listen to them and when we shouldn't.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in the first instance, to begin with, the fact that each of us is going to try to exploit the communication system to our ends means that each of us is probably going to evolve what you call, I think, epistemic vigilance or something.
Mm-hmm.
This
Exactly.
ability to critically analyze arguments, again, not necessarily from an objective perspective, but at least to see what kind of weaknesses they have from your point of view, what logical weaknesses there are. So but that does strengthen a logical faculty, this ability to pick apart arguments, even if you're using it to selfish ends. Let me, a little footnote here, I'm curious, and this is something that won't be of interest to many listeners, but to those conversant in Darwinian theory. Do you consider, is your perspective somewhat informed by group selectionist? No, it's purely individual selectionist. Okay.
Yeah, and the reason why that is that the more you have a group selectionist account, the more the interests of everybody in the group converge, by definition, and then the more they can rely on trust. So if our interests converge a lot, then we don't have to argue that much. I could just trust you. Well, argumentation, as I was saying, is a way of overcoming issues with trust. So the more trust you have, in a way, the less you need argumentation. And given that with group selection you should have more trust within the group members, then you would need argumentation less. So our theory isn't completely incompatible with group selection, but it's not predicted by it. So the more group selection there is, the less of reasoning as we understand it there should be.
Okay, and just quickly for people who aren't conversant in Darwinian theory, group selectionism is the idea that things very readily evolve for the good of the whole group. Not just the family, but like the tribe or whatever, or the flock or whatever. And an individual selectionist theory is more skeptical of that. So you're saying precisely because we don't naturally do things for the good of the group, two things happen. First, we develop this vigilance, this ability to pick apart arguments because they may not be in our interests. We have to be on guard. But also, we need to back up what we're saying precisely because there isn't a natural trust of what we are saying. So we have to learn to marshal reasoning on behalf of our arguments while being critical of the reasoning presented to us. And those two things together are, although you say in the paper, look, reasoning evolved for a lot of things, but still, those two things account for a lot of the dynamics of human reasoning.
Yeah, exactly. I think that gives a good account of the main features that psychologists before us and some of the work we've been doing have established for how reasoning works.
Okay. Now, it seems that you have to pretty soon distinguish between different kinds of arguments. So, I was listening to your TED Talk, and you were talking about the ability of reasoning to kind of do a good job of bringing a group to a consensus about what the truth is. On the other hand, you were talking in this particular instance about a particular kind of argument, and it's really an interesting one. So let's kind of lay it out. As I recall it, the little kind of puzzle was this. You said, okay, so like Ted is looking at Mary, Mary is looking at Bill. Ted is not married, Bill is married. Is someone who is not married looking at someone who is married? And, the intuition is to say we don't have enough information to say because we don't know whether married is not married. But then it turns out you look at it, and if either way, it is the case that, whether if you look at the case where Mary is married, and you look at the case, I shouldn't have chosen the name Mary, that's confusing. But if you look at the case where Mary is married, then she's being looked at by a non-married. If you look at the case where she's not married, and blah, blah, blah. So actually we can say with complete confidence that someone not married is looking. And you showed that initially almost nobody gets this right, but then you put people together and they argue, and they all come to agree. They see the merits of the argument. Okay, that's fine, but the arguments that bedevil us are largely of a different kind, right? They're about who deserves what. Who gets to fly their flag I saw a piece today about the University of Vermont let a Black Lives Matter flag fly right next to the American flag. Predictably, this led to controversy. There's the question of the Confederate flag being flown in the sun and so on. Or there are much clearer cases where you're talking about competition over just finite resources, more obviously zero-sum games, and that's a certain amount of what politics is about right now. So I would think you would be less optimistic in
Yeah.
about those kinds of things, right?
Yeah, no, I mean it's not a magic bullet. So when you're talking about cases in which indeed there is it's an objective truth to it or an objective good answer, then our prediction, which is kind of largely borne out, is that indeed the group will converge towards the good answer if at least the elements of the good answer are present in it initially. But then if you have very strong conflict of interests, argumentation is not going to solve this. Some of them are just intractable. People disagree. They have I mean, as you were saying, they just have different interests. Mm-hmm. And so at best what you can hope that argumentation might achieve is if someone finds a good non-zero sum game to play in that context, then that person may be able to persuade maybe the other ones to see the merit of their option. And I think that in small groups, that works relatively well. So if you look at the work of people like Elinor Ostrom, who've studied how small groups manage commons together and to without things completely falling apart, I think it works. I mean, there is a large part of it is argumentation and negotiation and people exchanging arguments about how we should punish people who are cheating. And in small groups, it works, I think, relatively well. How does that translate into large nation states? It's much less clear and much more complicated because all the politicians have multiple interests, and one of the problems I would think is that even if in a way if everything was behind closed doors, maybe they might be able to agree to each other, but they have also a pressure to behave in a way that is expected of them by their constituency, and things get extremely complicated. So in a way, all predictions are off when it gets that complicated.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and of course this helps explain why rhetorically people who are trying to bring consensus often emphasize the commonality of interest, the non-zero sum dynamic. Yeah. Don't we all want to make America strong? Don't we all want to do X, Y, and Z? And as a rhetorical matter, that can be effective, regardless, I guess, of how much of the actual contention it describes. So why don't you talk about some of the evidence that's consistent with the theory? I mean, one thing that's gotten a lot of attention lately, and these are elements of psychology that in some cases do complicate the business of us reaching consensus and coming together. Mm-hmm. One thing that's gotten a lot of attention over the last 10 years is confirmation bias. Mm-hmm. Talk a little about that.
So maybe a good way to set it up is to explain that. So in the psychology of reasoning, or in philosophy really in general, or in psychology in general, the dominant view of reasoning is what we can call kind of an individualist or an intellectualist view of reasoning, according to which the function of reasoning would be to figure things out on your own. You just you reason really hard about something, or a decision you have to make, or a belief you have to hold, and then you just get better. You choose better products, or you choose better political opinions. And if we wanted reasoning to work that way, ideally we'd like it to be as objective and kind of exigent or kind of demanding as possible. So you would want to look for reasons, pros and cons, and you would want to make sure that the reasons you're examining are good reasons. And so indeed what is sort of shocking with the confirmation bias, or the my-side bias, it's kind of been called both, is that it shows that reasoning doesn't work that way at all. So whenever you start thinking about something for which you have some kind of prior opinion, you will overwhelmingly find arguments for defending that prior opinion. And so indeed, it's been shown in many experiments, and kind of we all know that's how it works in a way. When you're reasoning on your own, then that usually leads to trouble. So people tend to become overconfident. They tend to polarize, to grow, to develop stronger attitudes. And so as much as I think that is a problem for this classical view of reasoning, I think it fits well with ours, because if the function of reasoning when it produces arguments is to convince someone else, then you want to have a confirmation bias. You want to find reasons that will support your beliefs and that will go against other people's opinions. That's for us, that's kind of usually the standard phrase. That's a phrase that's a feature, not a bug. But the thing that hasn't been maybe stressed enough in the way we've portrayed our theory, or other people have done so, is that this confirmation bias, when we produce arguments, has to be balanced by a much more objective stance when you evaluate other people's arguments. That is, if you are equally biased when you evaluate other people's arguments, then you would just reject all the arguments that challenge your point of view, which is kind of all the interesting arguments, really. And then you would just never change your mind, and argumentation would be largely pointless. So you have to. So I mean, our prediction regarding how we evaluate arguments when you hear someone else's give an argument that challenges your view is that you should be objective enough that if the argument is good, you recognize its strength, and you sort of change your mind accordingly. So that doesn't mean changing your mind completely, but at least changing your mind in the good direction.
Okay. Although there is, and I mean, again, I think here we have to distinguish between different kinds of arguments. Like if you're arguing that I shouldn't have something I want to have, in a certain sense, there's no such thing as a good argument for that case, from my point of view, right? I mean, I grant that to avoid completely embarrassing myself in argument, I have to concede obviously logical things. At the same time, I don't think you want to give the idea that in an argument like that, a kind of a moral argument, an argument about distribution of resources, that my mind really wants to acknowledge all the good points being made, right?
Yeah. I mean, indeed, we wouldn't predict that that Peter Singer is going to convince all of us to give all our money to poor Africans, or to stop eating all meat, and et cetera, et cetera. But you can still use moral arguments in a way that is effective. I mean, it's not. I don't think it would be true. It is true that moral arguments are as ineffective as they are sometimes portrayed. I mean, we know in our everyday lives, I think, that sometimes we talk to people about things we've done or things we plan on doing, and we can be swayed by thinking, "No, I mean, you're a jerk if you do this for such and such reasons." And sometimes, because we do care about our moral reputation, then these arguments can indeed sway us. I mean, historically, an example I've looked at a bit is, and I think it's kind of it's true of many other examples, the way slavery, or kind of rather the slave trade, was abolished in England in the late 18th century and early 19th century. It was mostly through it was largely through argumentation. People were saying, look, you can't be a good British Christian person and do this. It's just completely inconsistent to have these values and to engage in that practice.
Right. People were making those arguments, and I know you mentioned this in the paper I referred to, but I kind of wondered, how do you know that it was the arguments that were doing the work? I mean, there are these claims that actually, there are always claims that everything that happened for economic reasons, and I'm not conversant in the particular case made here, but I know there are people who say, look, actually the economics of slavery were changing, blah, blah, blah. Another example of this is, well, first of all, reply to that. I mean, it's hard to say for sure that the arguments were carrying the day, right? I mean, there is the case that everything that happens on op-ed pages in newspapers is just like a shadow play, and the real underlying power dynamics are what are shaping policy, right?
Yeah, no, on the whole, I would agree, but I think the two are partly are not kind of mutually contradictory. I mean, in the case of the abolition of the slave trade, it would seem as if, from my understanding, the economic argument would go against that, because mostly England was tending to lose quite a bit of, mostly they would lose a lot of cotton that would come in from the US, and they were relying on that to give people work in their factories. So, at the time anyway, all the economic arguments that people were using were against abolishing the slave trade. So now it is still the case that if you're in the south of the U.S., the economic value of slavery is still so strong for a long time that people would not have heard, if you're a southern planter, very few of them would have been convinced by such arguments, because so much of their livelihood relied on not, accepting these arguments. But still, even when the economic conditions are ripe, that doesn't mean that communication in general and argumentation more specifically doesn't help the process go faster. And actually, there is some evidence now in political science. People who've done studies of just kind of door-to-door canvassing. So they go to people's homes and they talk about controversial issues, and it seems to have some kind of impact on people's attitudes. So it's hard to tell then again if it's really argumentation per se or more, other types of communication, empathizing with the person you're talking with and other phenomena. But it seems that it probably has some kind of impact. Like for instance, I mean, if you look at like the huge changes that we've had in most kind of Western societies over the past 40 years, and the economy hasn't, we've gotten wealthier, but it's not clear why now that we're wealthier we should be so much more accepting of minorities, of homosexuals, of women's rights, blah blah blah. I mean, and it has been, these things have been heavily debated, not only in op-ed pages, but also, which might be more productive in homes. People talk about that with their friends, with their family. I mean, I wouldn't say that these things are inefficient. I mean, I agree with you that there isn't very strong evidence that it is, because it's just so hard to gather this type of evidence. Mm-hmm. But I don't think there is any strong evidence that it isn't either.
Right. You mentioned Peter Singer, and he actually, it's funny because he himself, in arguing in his book The Expanding Circle, which was about how basically morality has become more kind of cosmopolitan. In other words, people have grown to be more accepting of people from different ethnicities, different nations, and so on. There has been this expansion of the moral circle, so to speak, over the millennia at least, viewed in the long perspective. Peter's argument actually is a kind of a rationalist. I mean, it's about the power of reason. It's about people just seeing that, wait, if you demand something for yourself, it follows logically in some sense that people in similar circumstances deserve it, and so on. You could argue, and I've argued, that another powerful force has been just the growing web of non-zero sum connection. So there is interdependence, and here, and this is something I think is still insufficiently emphasized, is the extent to which our perception of whether we're in a zero-sum or non-zero-sum relationship with someone, whether we have fundamentally a conflict of interest or commonality of interest, the extent to which that shapes our view of them and of the arguments they make, right? And whether they are should be considered human beings worthy of decent treatment, and so on. I assume this enters into your own, because I think that perception so subtly influences the way we're not aware of it. I mean, often we're not aware. We don't consciously go, oh well, I can do a business deal with this person, therefore I'm going to say his religion is fine. It's more subtle than that. You're really, at an unconscious level almost, more amenable to thinking his religion is fine, right? So have you worked much with this?
No, because I mean, not that it's not interesting or that it's wrong, but I would say it mostly affects trust. I think what you were describing is how much you trust different people depending on how much your interests or how much you think your interests overlap, and so yes, I mean, because I've been saying that argumentation is a way of complementing trust, but in many ways the two of them really work together, because for most of the arguments that we will be exchanging, you also need trust to believe what the other person is saying to some extent. So for instance, if you've done something which I think was immoral or stupid, you can give me an argument trying to change my mind about that. And in many cases, that argument is going to rely on another piece of information that you have and that I don't. So you can say, well, I was mean to that guy, but he had been mean to me before, so that's fine. So in a way, not only do I have to evaluate that, okay, it makes sense that you're mean to someone because they've been mean to you before, it's fine, but I also have to trust you when you're telling me that he's been mean to you before. And so in many ways, although argumentation can help you overcome some of the problems you have with trust, you still need a lot of trust for people to effectively argue with each other. So argue not in the sense of having a shouting match, but to exchange arguments. And I think that's one of the, to come back to your initial question, that's one of the main issues we're having now in public discourse. It's not that people necessarily are too stupid to understand the arguments from the other side, it's that they don't trust the other side enough to accept the premises. So the problem might not be that we're just so biased that, we just reject all the arguments, is that, you don't trust the other side's experts, you don't trust their economists because you have economists on your side who disagree with them, you don't trust their politicians, you don't trust even their scientific experts. And once there is no trust, it's really hard to have a lot of good argumentation going on. So then again, so if you just have trust and no argumentation at all, it's kind of hard because you can't explain why other people should change their mind. But then if you have argumentation without trust, it works well in mathematics. So if you're a complete crook and I really think you're the worst person in the world, but you demonstrate a mathematical theorem, I'll have to accept it. But for most things, I need to rely on my trust in you to accept the premises before I can evaluate whether the arguments are sound or not. Mm-hmm. So I think that a lot of the problem is indeed, that's kind of, I'm thinking that a lot of people are saying that it's more of a problem with trust than with kind of argumentation per se, maybe.
Yeah, well, it's, yeah. Yeah, well, and there are, there's a whole range of, I think, cognitive biases that are to some extent influenced by whether we perceive the enemy as basically an ally or an enemy. But certainly, things like attribution error and so on. But but I think you're certainly right that in politics, more than has been the case sometimes, the two, at least in the United States, the two camps are seeing each other as just the enemy. And nothing they say is going to be taken as kind of sincerely motivated and plausible. Now, there's a dynamic you talk about, and again, and this dynamic helps explain why. I was almost surprised when I heard your TED Talk how optimistic you sounded about the ability of groups to reason together toward a common solution. Because I had heard about this thing that you do talk about in your paper called attitude polarization. And as I understand it, it's where being exposed to evidence contrary to your view and arguments contrary to your view actually makes you even more confident that you are right than you were before, right?
Yeah, so that's been shown to happen in some experiments. The issue is that that only happens, or that mostly happens, when you're reading an argument. So let's say you're reading an argument from a newspaper whose political stance you disagree with, and then you read an op-ed, and what is going to polarize you is not just the mere fact of reading the argument that challenges your point of view, is that kind of automatically, as a reaction to that, you're going to generate a bunch of counter arguments. So you're going to think, no, this guy is so wrong for this, and that reason. And this generation of counter arguments is going to polarize, to make you think that you're even more right than you were before reading the piece. But our contention is that if you could actually talk to the guy who wrote the op-ed, he would be able, or she would be able to address many of these counter arguments, and there you shouldn't polarize anymore. So I think a lot of the problem is that we're not actually talking with people from the other side. We're seeing their arguments, and then we're processing them on our own. And we're not. It's rare enough that people don't talk politics all that much, maybe more in France than in the US, but because it can turn sour pretty easily, and it's considered maybe a bit rude and whatnot. And also because we're mostly surrounded by people who share our political views. And so you're mostly exposed to arguments from the other side without being able to talk to the person. So the argument might sound stupid because the argument was mostly kind of tailored for other people in that group. And so you think that for many reasons it's obviously completely retarded, but maybe in quite a few cases, I would say, if you could talk to the person who made the argument in the first place, you would realize that actually it's not that stupid, and that some, at least, of your counter arguments would be addressable, and therefore you might, you change your mind of the person making the argument, and maybe potentially on the issue itself. And I think that's sort of what you see when you actually have groups talking with each other, rather than just people reading arguments in a newspaper or in an experiment. And although you can still have polarization, so if you take a group of extremely kind of people, strong Republicans and strong Democrats, and you have them talk about some really contentious issue together, they might quickly kind of stop talking to each other kind of they can't stop. They can. It's like a presidential debate in a way. People are talking to each other, but not really. I mean, we know it's just something they want to talk to the audience. But in many cases, still people who've done experiments in deliberative democracy. So when they bring citizens together, and people from both sides of the political spectrum in the U.S., and they have them talk about policy issues. On the whole, it works quite well. So people do tend to become more homogeneous in their views, to become more understanding of where the other side thinks. So, and the evidence actually where things don't work so poorly.
Are there particular examples of this, well-known examples, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of empirical studies in which people have just, basically you try to take a random sample of the population, and you bring them together and you have them talk about, kind of social security or some kind of policy, and you measure their views before and after the discussion, and on the whole, it seems to work well. I think one of the examples that was the most striking is Fishkin did this. I think it was Fishkin who did this in Northern Ireland and they took Catholics and Protestants and they had them talk about things that are quite sensitive, like education, and people they're very good at talking with each other and at finding common ground. Even it was it was pretty divided and pretty quite a bit worse than Republicans and Democrats. So the evidence there is really, I think, kind of supports this optimism.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, an experience we've had with this format. I mean, I started doing this about 10 years ago on the site bloggingheads.tv, and it's unmediated conversation. And we would bring together liberals and conservatives, and they would talk directly to each other. And that seemed to have a civilizing effect compared to the situation where there's a debate and a moderator. Because when there's like a moderator, who asks you a question, you don't have to direct your answer to the person you're arguing with. You're talking still to the moderator about the person, or to the audience about the person. And I think that kind of fails to evoke some kind of civilizing instincts that direct conversation does evoke. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, totally. I think what happens is largely that you have a different audience in mind. So it's like, in a presidential debate, clearly they're not talking to each other. They're talking to people who support them, to try to bolster them. And then when you have to make the effort to actually try to convince the person who is in front of you, so you have to understand their arguments in the first place. Even if it's only to try to reply to them, you have to understand them. And you have to try to find arguments that will talk to that person. And in the process, I mean, you do become kind of spontaneously nicer and also, more understanding. I mean, you kind of have to, even if it's just for winning, in the process, you can't help yourself but having to understand their point of view.
Also, you're talking to somebody pretty smart and well-informed. And you're thinking, I want to convince them, and not like just the average person who knows almost nothing about this issue.
Yeah, you have to make more of an effort,
So, I think we should pause and make sure people understand one thing that I think is being said here, which is that we're not just talking about the way reasoning works in argumentation. We're also talking about the way you're organizing the information in the first place, long before you this is what confirmation bias is partly, right? It isn't just when you're arguing with someone that you suddenly, for the first time, become aware of the evidence supporting your view. It's that once you have a view, you go around perceiving the landscape of information in this biased way that selectively draws on things supporting your view. So the prospect that you may find yourself in an argument shapes your everyday perception, right?
Partly, yeah. I mean, so it is only one of the things that shape your everyday perception. So on the whole, I mean, except for reasoning as the way we see it, just about every other cognitive mechanism is looking for surprising information. I mean, the more surprising a piece of information is, the more informative it is, sort of by definition. And so that's why you obviously we're oriented our attention towards things that are weird and that are new, and that's how you can do experiments with with babies and all that. And so on the whole, I mean, when you see, so people have done experiments, for instance, in which they've shown people behaving in a way that goes against the stereotype, and our first reaction, our intuitive reaction, is to be more attracted and to pay more attention to things that go against our stereotypes. But then when you have more time to think about things, then you go back to things that support your stereotype, because you're more in this mode, okay, I'm going to try to find reasons, to try to anticipate an argument basically, and so part of what our mind does, as you were saying, is we're trying to anticipate these arguments, and you look for things that might support your point of view. But it's not the only thing we're doing. So I mean, on the whole, our brains should mostly be wired to look for things that surprise us and that go against our assumptions, except for reasoning, this one bit that prepares you to defend your point of view, which should be looking for information that supports your point of view so that you're better able to defend it.
Okay. Robert Trivers a long time ago came up with this idea that in order to deceive others, we sometimes deceive ourselves, and that you heard, I think, a little of that in the passage I quoted from my own book. That was kind of Trivers influenced, I think. But and the idea there is, I mean, first of all, I came up with I think some examples from the actual animal kingdom, but as it applies to humans, the idea is that if you're going to argue with conviction, you have to believe what you're saying, and that helps explain why it's like not in your interest to be consciously aware necessarily of the evidence that's against your view, which in a way sounds strange because you'd think it's actually in your interest to be able to anticipate arguments that are going to be made. But anyway, the Trivers argument would be that at least at a conscious level, even if the information against your view is floating around somewhere in your brain and perhaps is even going to be readily accessible, at a conscious level, you want to have a kind of a one-sided view so that you can argue with conviction about what you deserve and what the other person doesn't deserve. How does that make sense to you, and how much does that inform your theory, if at all?
I wouldn't really agree with that on the whole, actually, because I mean, I guess for us the logic just doesn't work for me in a way, because so what would be the point in a way of doing all this? So I mean, you have beliefs, and you want to convince others to share your beliefs for a variety of reasons, and that's why you want to find arguments for them. But the goal, I mean, the overall goal is still to have kind of sound beliefs. You want to have a good representation of the world. You want to and if you're wrong, your overall interest is still to get things right.
Well,
even
no,
if that
I
means
would say, I mean, I think your own theory is that the ultimate goal is not to have sound beliefs. The ultimate goal is to win arguments.
No, but the ultimate goal of the mind as a whole. So you have this one device that is trying to help you win arguments, which is reasoning, but the vast, which is that just one little kind of module in your mind. But the vast majority of the mind, as the part that creates beliefs, its goal is to have just a good representation of the world, because
sure.
you're really screwed
like
otherwise.
If I'm going hunting and the animal's on the other side of the hill, I want to find the best way to get around the hill. There's all kinds of things where I just want a clear view of reality. But I think to the extent that we're talking about like problems that bedevil the world of the kind I've described, like people not agreeing and coming to hate each other and so on, those are cases where what the mind is designed to do is win the argument. I would think this would be your view, that in this realm, the mind is designed fundamentally to win the argument and to become aware of contrary evidence to the extent that that helps win the argument.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, even in these domains in which our interests conflict, so we want to argue about how to share the pie. You still have to be grounded somewhat in reality. So, for instance, if we've done something together and we're talking about how we are going to share the proceeds, on the one hand, I have an incentive to try to keep everything for me, and to not give anything to you, and you have the same incentive. But then, if I really try to push that too hard, you're just never going to work with me again. So. We have an incentive to defend our reputation, which is extremely important, and without which we really couldn't work together at all. And to some extent, that entails a degree of objectivity and of kind of not being too much in bad faith. That I think kind of goes against that idea that we really have to go so far into deceiving others that we have to deceive ourselves first. I mean, I see the whole thing as being much more cooperative than I think Trivers sees it.
But to the extent that what you're saying is the case, wouldn't you see less confirmation bias? I mean, it's usually confirmation bias is entirely consistent with what he's saying. We are, at a conscious level at least, we're organizing the information. We're organizing the information in a way that both does facilitate our arguing on our behalf, but also bolsters our own conviction that we're in the right.
Yeah, I think that's a side that's kind of an unintended side effect of the confirmation bias, because if you're talking with someone, so when the confirmation bias will really bolster your views is when you're reasoning on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have no one to oppose you. You're just piling up arguments for your side because of that confirmation bias, and so you become more polarized and more confident. I don't think that's what reasoning evolved for at all. That's just a side effect of the fact that we're in the world we live in. We spend too much time anticipating arguments that never come, and so that happens. Mm-hmm. But for us, really, reasoning evolved to work in a dialogic, interactive context, in which case the confirmation bias shouldn't do this. So if the two of us are talking, what the confirmation bias should do is help the two of us find arguments for our respective sides, and then in most cases, one of us is going to somewhat change their mind in the direction opposite to their own confirmation bias. And then if you manage to convince me, you're not really going to become that much more confident. You just you manage to change my mind, but that's it. So I think that this side effect of this is a side effect of the confirmation bias. People becoming more confident in a way that is not rationally warranted. I don't think it's what you would have evolved for. Otherwise we'd just be reasoning on our own much more even than we are. And it would just be so kind of vastly maladaptive in many cases.
Don't you think when people feel moral indignation, they feel they are in the right, generally speaking? And don't you think moral indignation is itself an evolved, adaptive thing?
Yeah, we always think we're right. Every belief that your intuitions come up with, our default stance towards our own cognitive mechanisms is that if you think something, it's there's a spectrum from we can doubt our own intuitions or we can be really sure, but otherwise we couldn't go anywhere.
Right, but if you believe moral indignation is an evolved thing because it can be a persuasive thing, and people say, "Whoa, that person's so indignant." Yeah, they must. It works in certain situations. Then it seems to me you would think that the brain would organize information in a way conducive to sincere displays of moral indignation, and it seems pretty clear that partial access to the information does sustain moral indignation.
Yeah, but the problem, then again, from the point of view of the evolution of communication, that doesn't work because it's not a reliable signal. Just it's very easy and it's cheap and it's free really to be as indignant as possible. So then we would have some kind of arm race in which people would be maximally indignant all the time, and we would pay no attention to how indignant other people are because it's not a reliable signal. So the thing needs to be grounded in something that benefits both parties. So if you are you still need to give me good arguments. The arguments have to convince me. They can't just...
Well, right, but, you're right. When there's an arms race like this, you have to be able to send signals of commitment and sincerity, but moral indignation kind of serves as that. If I get up and... moral indignation gets people, for one thing, to make declarations, right? It drives people to say, look, if I'm wrong about this, or if you don't do that, or I've never been... And people take it as a signal. They take it as especially when you know someone, you're in a relationship with them, you're going, whoa, they haven't been that indignant in 6 months. This is important to them. So this is a case where the signals are capable of carrying messages about commitment, I think.
Yeah, but then you don't need argumentation. You just need you should have a mechanism that tailors your level of indignation to the optimum level. You don't need a whole other thing to find arguments and everything. That's something else. Then if you want to argue for your level of indignation, that's a different process from just getting others to accept it because you're committed to it.
So it seems to me the two systems are capable of interacting and evolving in interaction. Yeah. But that aside, so you have a model where it just seems to me, according to your model, we should be much more aware of information inconsistent with our argument than we are. Or maybe what I'm saying is we should start off from a more reasonable position than we start off from. If we've had in the United States a series of these police shootings, mm-hmm. And, people on one side of the argument or the other will marshal tremendous indignation before there's really any evidence at all, or when there's only the slightest evidence. And maybe I'm partly biased because I used to be a journalist, and being a journalist, it makes you realize until you've heard everyone's side of the story and seen all the evidence, you should be really skeptical of your initial belief. So maybe that's it. But it seems to me people on both sides of issues do. It's just a fact that they get really indignant in ways that are inconsistent with your view of the thing, because they are actually exposing themselves to possible ready refutation down the line when more evidence comes out, as it has in some cases. And they stick to. I mean, the case of Ferguson, I don't know if you know, that was like the initial big thing here. That turned out to be, as the evidence was presented in court, that turned out to be much more complicated than people originally thought. There are huge numbers of people in America who have not altered their beliefs one bit in light of that evidence. They still have an image of a guy who was just standing, minding his own business. They said, put your hands up. He put his hands up, and they shot him. It's totally clear that's not what happened, but these are human beings who, that seems to me inconsistent with your view.
Yeah, I mean, and then again, it's. I mean, all of this class of beliefs, which have which have little practical consequences for the people who hold them, behaves a bit weirdly. So we have a lot of beliefs in our kind of big modern societies, which basically it doesn't matter. You can have different views on Ferguson and on all of basically any political issue, and it's going to make no practical difference to your everyday life. I mean, for the vast majority of us. And so the cognitive mechanisms that are shaping how we think about these beliefs might have more to do with kind of how other people in our groups think about them than about how kind of really assessing their accuracy. And so my prediction would be that for things that actually matter, when you have a decision to make that will impact you directly, people should be more objective and accurate in their assessments, and then for these kind of beliefs, I mean, in a way, I agree with you that the overwhelming concern that people have is not necessarily to have true beliefs, because it really doesn't matter really in the slightest whether they do or not. But still, I mean, you're saying things like people never, many people don't change even in light of the evidence. There's, we don't know. I mean, it's my guess would be that many people have changed their mind when they're presented with the evidence, and that that's an empirical claim. I don't have more data than you do, but I mean, clearly, some people, the most vocal people are not necessarily the most representative, and my guess would be, I would be surprised if, for instance, I remember hearing about that, and when I saw the evidence, I changed my mind, and that's maybe what you did, and we're not that weird. I hope so.
Well, yeah, but we're not identifying with a particular. We don't naturally identify with the other side. I'm not a black guy. I didn't grow up black in America. That has not shaped my perspective. Or maybe if I weren't black but were from a demographic that just has run-ins with the police. If I had a bunch of run-ins with the police and been mistreated, whatever, these various things, shape the stakes you feel you have in the argument. And I think you said earlier that if you really have stakes in the argument, then your mind should be working clearly. I think these are cases where people perceive themselves as having stakes. They're arguing about future policies that will shape the way they and people they identify with are treated by police. So it's a real concrete argument from their point of view, I think.
Yeah. But then I guess you can see how in many cases people make arguments that are kind of, you need to be kind of a bit, you need to generalize a bit, I guess. So you can't, and the point is that, the police is behaving, towards African Americans in a way that isn't appropriate in many cases, and that is, dangerous for African Americans. And then I can see how when you're on that side of the issue, you can see the other side is being nitpicking. So you have a pattern that seems to be relatively clear. And then when someone from the other side tells you, well, but actually, in this specific case, the guy maybe was not completely, maybe he was doing something a bit suspicious. You're like, okay, but I don't care, because, that's not kind of, the main point still stands, and that's why I can see how, if presenting to one person the fact that in the Ferguson case, maybe the evidence isn't that clear cut, that wouldn't change their overall view of the issue. I wouldn't see that as being necessarily that surprising, because it's informed, as you were saying, by their personal experiences and by kind of maybe other data that is out there.
Okay, one thing that may be relevant here. I mean, you said that the people, the most vocal people, may not be representative of all the people. One thing about the most vocal people is they've probably been discussing this publicly, like throughout the controversy, when these controversies unfold. And I think one thing is that when people take a position in public, that affects how tightly they cling to it, right?
Yeah, it makes sense, because so it depends on the communities you're in and all that, but so on the whole, people will see you as being smarter and more rational if you have true beliefs. But there's always a small cost to be paid when you have to change your mind. It's better to be right all along than to be wrong and then right. It's better to be wrong and then right than to be wrong all along. But the best is still to not have to change your mind so there's always a small cost to pay in terms of reputation when you have to change your mind to accept something else. And so indeed, as you were saying, when you have committed yourself in front of many, many people, then there's a larger cost to pay if you have to change your mind. And I think one of the issues as well is that there's a kind of an informational asymmetry. So if you take public figures like politicians, you might imagine that maybe in many cases, I would say, being extremely optimistic, that they would have maybe appreciated evidence that might have led them to change their mind. But they know that their constituents do not have this evidence, and that they might maybe not be able to understand it or to access it or to pay attention to it. And therefore, it would be rational for them to change their mind, but they realize that other people would not understand that it is rational for them to change their mind, and therefore they have to stick to their beliefs, because they would just being seen as flip-floppers. I mean, if all of their constituents knew why this person would be changing their mind, maybe they'd be fine with it. But that is very rarely the case. I mean, the most visible people usually are, we pay attention to them because they are supposed to have more information, to pay more attention to the issues. And then if you see them changing their mind, you can't necessarily understand why, and then you have a problem on your hands.
Mm-hmm. And of course, with most issues, most people who have an opinion don't have time or the expertise to really have the opinion be deeply informed. Like take something like climate change. People on both sides are actually taking their signals from elites they respect.
Yeah, as they should.
And so if the elites are reluctant to change their mind, then because they're elites and they've taken positions publicly, and everyone else is taking their signals from the elites, I think we've come to another case where I think I'm a little less optimistic than you generally are about these things.
Yeah, but I mean, even climate change, I mean, it's so, things aren't going as well as they should be, but I mean, in a way, you still see many, many people who are unlikely to be, severely impacted by climate change, who are, taking action, who are supporting policies that will, obviously, I can see how it's not as good as it should be, and people should be acting more, blah, 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 and I completely agree with that. But what we're seeing is still, in many ways, completely amazing. That we have, many, many countries are agreeing on things that are clearly, to a large extent, against their economic interests. And it's also, there is something quite impressive with it, I think, with the way we're handling the situation. I mean, things could be much worse.
Yeah, although I should say, when I said people on both sides are taking their signals from elites, I include myself. I mean, I assume that the liberal side of this is right. But the truth is, the only thing I'm reasonably sure of is that the world is getting warmer. I haven't looked closely at the arguments that there could be these alternative explanations. I haven't done that work. I'm accepting, So I didn't mean to be, accusing one side or the other of anything in that.
No, cognitively, I think both sides, the vast majority of people on both sides are using the same kind of processes,
right.
In terms of, referring to different elites. It just so happens that in one case, one side happens to be referring to the good sort of elites, the scientific consensus.
Yeah.
But that's, how that happened. On other issues, you can imagine that liberals might be, being on the wrong end of the stick.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're at our usual quitting time, but do you want to say anything you haven't said about this, or talk about current kind of interesting work you're doing on this, or work you envision doing, or
Yeah, so I think one of the things we're going to try to stress now is the more optimistic side of the story, as you are saying. So one of the things we're planning on doing with the student, for instance, is to see if people talking with each other will help them having more accurate political beliefs. So there are a few things that people are known to get really wrong. So how many immigrants are there in your country? What is the percentage of the budget that is spent on foreign aid? People, have vastly overestimated views of both of these things, and we'll see if getting people to talk with each other might get them to have more accurate views on these things, and there is a true answer. So it's not like Israel and Palestine. I mean, there is like an actual correct answer, and we'll see. But it's still kind of politically relevant. So we'll see if in these cases things work better. And we want to look at how we can try to design experiments that would show that when people evaluate arguments, even from someone they don't really trust, or arguments that challenge their views, there is some kind of thing in their mind that kind of lights up, so to speak, when they see a good argument. So then they might have reasons to reject the conclusion anyway. They might think of counter arguments. But when you're presented with a good argument, even if that challenges you, you see it. They're gonna, you recognize that there is something there and that you have to address before you can move on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And where can people go to keep track of your work? Is there a website or a Twitter feed or?
My website. I don't use Twitter, and Facebook is, I guess, not public enough. So yeah, my website. I don't know the URL, but if you Google Hugo Mercier, I'm still the first hit, I think. So there's a close competitor now, but
okay. Is there another Hugo Mercier who?
Yeah, there's another Hugo Mercier who is also French. He does a band you put on your head when you sleep that measures your EEG, I think, rhythm that helps you sleep better.
I see.
And he's younger.
Well, maybe if you can argue that his product is deficient.
Yeah.
Don't you feel that his product? I mean, think about it. Don't you think his product is probably deficient?
I have many reasons to think so, but I will. No, I obviously don't know. He might actually be even coming from the same area as I am. But so yeah, it's another Frenchman called Hugo Mercier, who is telling me.
Well, good luck in your battle with him and with all other people who hold false views. Okay, thanks a lot, Hugo.
Thanks.